Hey everyone, Gabriel here. You've probably noticed that Chaser Chat took a bit of a hiatus over the last 6 months or so, and I am beyond excited to be back. It won't just be my voice hosting shows now though. I've added an entire team of podcasters to the Chaser Chat roster, combined with an incredible support staff who will be helping out with editing, managing social media, graphic design, merch, and more. We'll be releasing 3 episodes per week from here on out. I'm placing a bet on Chaser Chat, and I'm putting my money where my mouth is. That's where you, the listener, come in. At the end of this episode, I'll run through all of the ways that you can support Chaser Chat, so please consider helping out if you enjoy the show. All right, that's enough of that. Let's get into the episode.
Welcome back to the Chaser Chat podcast, everybody. My name is Kyle Gillette, and this is going to be the first episode of a new series on the Chaser Chat podcasts. What we're going to be doing is reviewing some research or articles, things published in the meteorological community. And we're going to be talking with the authors of the research of the articles and discussing what it means, why it's important to the community, especially in regards to storm chasing. And I have a special guest on today who is part of a team of brilliant names that have just published, just in the last month here, a really great article in BAM. With me right now is Jannick Fischer, and he is currently a postdoc in Germany. And what's really special is that we've got a lot of names on this list and from different countries as well. So this is very nice. This is from Karlsruhe Institute of Technology in Germany. So Jannick, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
What we're going to be talking about is your recent BAMS article in the Bulletin of American Meteorological Society, Supercell Tornadogenesis, Recent Progress in Our State of Understanding. And this is a brilliant kind of way to round up a lot of the research that's happened in the last decade and beyond and point us in the direction for the decade to come. And you're the principal author of this article. There's a lot of other names on this.
Yeah, exactly. That's one thing I should definitely mention before going into the weeds here. I'm the lead author on this, but as a postdoc, I really rely on many of the excellent researchers that are also on the author list. And I'm just going to mention them briefly here. So it's Johannes Dahl, Chris Weiss, and Alex Schüth from Texas Tech University. Then Bryce Coffer, Matt Parker, Jenna Hauser, and Paul Markowski were also involved with this.
Yeah, those are some great minds in the fields of supercell and tornado research. And seeing this being published, it certainly got a lot of people excited, both in the chaser community and also in the research community in terms of mesoscale meteorology and things of that nature. And this is a really neat article because this isn't necessarily one of the big beefy modeling studies or something where we're proposing new fluid dynamics equations or something crazy like that. This is what you guys call here in the significant statement of the article, a non-technical overview of how tornadoes form. I've looked through this. I haven't seen a single equation in here. Of course, there's a lot of conceptual references to the math in here, but there's no actual math. And so it's very neat to see a kind of roundup of what we know and what we want to know in the future, to lay the framework for future studies and future research. Jan, why was doing this article important? What was the point of doing the non-technical overview?
Yeah, there were definitely several aspects that were important to us, but one is that, like you already mentioned, that a lot of recent articles or past articles on tornadogenesis or in general in the field of severe storms are really technical, just because the topic is so complex in many aspects. So one thing we wanted to achieve with this is to reach a broader audience and make these topics more accessible to basically everyone. But of course, we also at the same time wanted to stay scientifically correct as best as we could. So we did this by including all the relevant literature that goes a bit more into the details for people who want to know more.
Yeah, this is one of the things that you start off on pretty early on. And if you're listening, I certainly hope that you have found yourself a copy of this article, listeners, just to read along with some of the things that we're mentioning. I know that in kind of part number 1 here, where we're talking about how does a tornado form, you talk a lot about the myths, and some of them are some of the old wives' tales, like the crashing of warm and cold air, right? There are a lot of myths or perhaps maybe misconceptions in meteorology to a degree, but also especially in the chasing field sometimes. And it's just because some of this information, there's different theories and all kinds of things. So it's certainly nice to see some of those things brought to light, and then also providing evidence against that, or a unified front for what we know.
Yeah, exactly. And you might be surprised, but in the US, you're not even that bad compared to Europe, for example, here, where it's really a lot worse. People don't really learn anything about severe storms and specifically tornadoes, just because it's more rare and don't impact so many people.
Sure. Yeah. And we have had many discussions, whether it's on social media or in the field or what have you, conferences, things where we're discussing our tornadoes, a bottom up process or a top down process, our land spouts tornadoes, is a whole different thing. So there's a lot of debate in the field about the process, what they are. And it's nice to see a groundwork being laid for rounding up what we know so that we can jump forward. So what I want to do here is just walk through some basic parts. So Jannick, why don't you give us an overview of the paper as a whole? Without going too into depth, just what is the paper in general?
Okay, yeah. So I think it's best for everyone, if it's possible. Like you said, the article is out there and it's, I think, also openly accessible. So like it's really best if the listeners or you back there at home or in your car, take a look when you have a time, at least take a look at specifically figure 1 in the article. And if you can't do that right now, maybe picture your favorite supercell that you chased or that you saw sometime. For me, at least, what this figure was based on is the Earth Sudan, Texas supercell from May 16th, 2021. And what this figure shows, which goes into these 4 stages of tornadogenesis, how we separated it, it looks at the supercell from the rear flank, most times from the western side. And we're seeing the lower part of the updraft there in the low-level mesocyclone. And then it describes these 4 stages of tornadogenesis. That's mostly what the paper is doing. And when you look at that, you will see that in the caption of or the title of the first subplot there is the generation of mesocyclonic rotation, and the second step would be generation of surface level rotation or surface level vertical vorticity. The third step would be stretching and organization of that low level near ground rotation, and then also the transition to a tornado. And what I would like to emphasize here is that this is not reinventing the wheel about tornadogenesis. We're really basing this on excellent research over the past century by many excellent researchers like Rich Rotono, Bob Davies-Jones, and many others who really gave us the basics for this. But what we wanted to do here is update it with the most recent aspects about tornadogenesis, what basically happened in the last 5 to 10 years since the last review came out. And I think I'm just going to go through these 4 stages here, if you don't mind.
Absolutely, yes. That was actually my next question. Let's just start at mesocyclonic rotation and just jump into that. You don't have to go too into the weeds if you don't want to, but of course, you're more than welcome.
Yeah, I think it's good to keep it short here. And if you're interested, take a look at the article and also all the excellent references in there. But yeah, starting with first stage mesocyclonic rotations is really where Bryce Coffer and Matt Parker, the co-authors, did a lot of work on in the past years. Because what we first need for specifically supercell tornadogenesis is, of course, a rotating updraft, so the mesocyclone. And that is happening via the tilting of horizontal rotation into the vertical. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this concept, that if you have wind shear in the environment, that is the source of horizontal vorticity. And if once air parcels get moved or get sucked into the updraft, they tilt this horizontal rotation into the vertical, leading to updraft rotations of the mesocyclone. And what Bryce Coffer really nicely showed in his recent studies, one just came out last year, for example, which is really great, is showing that really the low-level mesocyclone is fed via this wind shear in the lowest few hundred meters. And the low-level mesocyclone, as many of you will know, is the crucial part for tornadogenesis. So this is one of the aspects we wanted to highlight. But then also for the tornado to form, of course, we need rotation really close to the ground because this generation of mid-level rotation cannot explain rotation close to the ground at a sufficient intensity so the tornado can form. And the current consensus on how this low-level rotation or the rotation close to the ground forms is via a so-called downdraft mechanism or baroclinic mechanism. Some may know it as the Davies-Jones-Brooks mechanism, where it's really happening in the outflow of the storm. So once the supercell forms precipitation that cools the air and forms a cool downdraft, which reaches the ground and forms a cold pool. And in this cold pool, we see a lot of turbulence, but also a consistent source of vertical vorticity, because parcels that move past downdrafts, they experience horizontal vorticity generation, which then gets again tilted in a way that vertical vorticity can be generated. Not going too much into detail here, there's also excellent articles on that referenced in this paper.
Yeah, so if I could just quickly just kind of round up what you're saying here, maybe in slightly more basic terms, just a little bit. Essentially, what we're seeing here is the environmental wind shear as the supercell is young and going through its stage of maturing. You're inducing the rotation onto the mesocyclone, both through the environmental wind shear and, of course, the supercell dynamics. And with time, you're also developing the cold pool and the rear flank or the forward flank downdrafts. And when you get the forward flank gust front or the rear flank gust front, when they interact with or near the updraft, you end up with turbulent eddies and things in more layman's terms near the updraft region. So initially, you could say that a majority of the process in the first two stages is going to be related more to the environment, perhaps, rather than, of course, you'll get into this, I'm sure, in a moment in parts like C and D, where more of the process seems to be related to particularly supercell dynamics or the mesocyclone dynamics rather than the environment itself. Would you say that kind of steps A and B are more dependent on the environment than anything?
That's a great question. The first step, definitely. Of course, the formation of the mesocyclone, as I explained, really relies on this wind shear being present in the environment. In the second step, it's a mix. It's really the storm generating this outflow and thereby generating its own low-level or near-ground vertical vorticity. So what the basis for how the tornado forms. So that's storm generated. But there also have been other studies which looked into how near-surface rotation could be generated. And specifically, there's a really new article by Paul Markowski who shows that actually this could also be generated in the environment and then just be transported below the mesocyclone base. So there's currently some debate going on.
Sure. Okay. So, yeah, that at least when I was reading through the article, I broke it into two major pieces where maybe part A leading into a beginning of part B. And for reference for listeners, that's part A is mesocyclonic rotation transitioning to part B, which is surface level vertical vorticity and its role that it plays. So I broke it apart into the environment needs to at least set up the storm in the first place or set up the mesocyclone in the beginning. And then after that, a majority of the process seems to relate to the storm and its evolution in the mesocyclone and its dynamics and things of that nature.
Yeah, you could see it that way, yeah, for sure.
So then when we get to the generation of surface level vertical vorticity, you do some later on reading, and it certainly seems like this is a very poorly understood component of this, where those patches of vorticity come from, how they continue to organize. But there's certainly some great reading in here. And you do go into quite a bit of depth on our current understanding of that. But it certainly is fascinating how we can potentially develop these patches of vorticity and then they eventually organize in part C to that stretching, that organization.
Yeah. And one aspect about that we wanted to clarify here, which is really not included in previous conceptual models, is that it really involves these chaotic, turbulent structures, like you said. And then in the third stage, the organization of these really small scale maxima. Maybe some of you are familiar with Lee Orff's simulations and some of his really great animations, where you see a lot of really small scale vortices and rotation maxima merging together to form the tornado in his simulations. And I think this is one aspect we really wanted to introduce to the community in this article.
If you could summarize how that process works to a degree.
Yeah, so this is largely based on thoughts by my advisor at Texas Tech, Johannes Dahl, who showed that any disorganized or misshaped vorticity maximum, for those who are not familiar with vorticity works, maybe just imagine a really elongated area with rotation, that this will organize over time by itself because of its characteristic flows, maybe I can say it that way, but over time by itself to one symmetric vortex. In real supercells, this is overlapped with the stretching which is supplied by the mesocyclone. So since we have this low-level mesocyclone in place, like you said, from the first stages of the generation of the supercell, and this low-level mesocyclone is really important because it supplies lift really close to the ground where these patches of these irregular regions with rotation reside in the cold pool. And then they can get lifted, and at the same time they organize from this misshapen structure to one symmetric vortex. And this is basically the time where tornadogenesis happens. But it happens over the course of several minutes. So sometimes you can see that in time lapses, for example, that the rotation near the wall cloud, for example, organizes and becomes stronger over the time of several minutes.
Of course, this brings up the question, right? Because you are talking about these vorticity patches or local vorticity maxima that are generated by the cold pool, and then they end up beneath the low-level mesocyclone. And you're saying the low-level mesocyclone, by its pressure gradient accelerations near the ground, it is, sucking up that air from the ground upwards into the updraft. And so the organization of the vorticity maxima into a tornado would happen near the ground, and then it extends upwards through the cloud base. So I guess that brings us to a good point here. I'd like you to set the record straight with the up down or down up. This would suggest, and you do, of course, talk about this quite a bit here in the paper. There's a nice sidebar that demonstrates this process, but this would seem to suggest that tornadoes are then a down-up process.
Yeah, and I think this is what Jenna Hauser's work is really nicely showing. She's doing observations with radars, and there's also one figure about that in this article. And I think in the most cases, at least, that she investigated with these mobile radars, it's really clear that the rotation first organizes close to the ground and then develops upwards. So this is really consistent with this bottom-up process of tornadogenesis, as we also see in the simulations, which is my part of the work.
And I for listeners, I highly recommend checking out this sidebar, because it really does explain the almost illusion that the funnel is reaching down from the ground. It goes in some pretty simple terms on the actual dynamics that causes the funnel to appear to descend, even though the vortex is likely already in contact with the ground and it's ascending up to the cloud base. It really is. There's a couple of graphs on here as well. And then Parker also has a great photo kind of illustrating this. The funnel's halfway up, but you can clearly see that the dust swirl has made it all the way up to the cloud base. It really is a fascinating kind of topic in the world of chasing and in meteorology as a whole as well, because we've had so many observations of the funnel snaking down and then eventually coming in contact with the ground. But of course, we know by fluid dynamics that both things can be true. The funnel can appear to descend while the rotation's already occurring at the ground and ascending upwards, because it is literally being pulled upwards into the mesocyclone. So it's really nice that this was also, of course, it's very important, obviously, but it's nice that it was also touched on in detail here, because it's one of those hot topics. And I'm sure that there are probably instances where maybe some things don't necessarily always go according to this. And I know you touched on that a little bit, where, and this is just the supercell case, right? There's also the QLCS and every other thing, and the Landspout case and things of that nature too. So there's certainly some exceptions to this, but it would appear, based on Hauser's observations, I've seen some of those at a conference in Iowa back in March, and they're just fascinating. And of course, in the modeling studies as well. I think that this kind of provides some good evidence that the bottom-up process is more than likely the most likely situation.
Yeah, and I can totally understand people who say that this tornado is touching down is the straightforward way to describe when tornadogenesis happens. And what we didn't want to do here is annoy people to not use that term anymore. At least I don't want to do that. But I think it's important to clarify what is going on in order to avoid misunderstandings. Because even if we only see a little bit of a funnel, it could still be strong rotation close to the ground. The tornado might not be touched down, if you want to say it like that, but there might already be strong rotation, and it could already be dangerous. It's okay for me if people want to use touching down to describe this process, but please be aware of what is actually going on, that there's probably a rotating column that extending from the ground up into the cloud already once this funnel is forming.
Hey everyone, Kay here from Rough Skies Ahead and Chaser Chat. I wanted to give a quick shout out to the new Chaser Chat YouTube page, where you can find all your favorite episodes uploaded in video form with a transcription to follow along with. The link is in the podcast description. All right, back to the episode.
That's a great point. And there's a lot of talk about the public-facing term of touching down. That's what the public understands. Is right now the really right time to rewrite what a tornado does in the public eye, things of that nature. So that, of course, there's an argument to be made there about what we call it, but I certainly am glad that there's research in addition to stuff that Hauser's already put out that's going to continue to grow, or at least sway maybe the public opinion about how this works. It's funny that something like this, as maybe as controversial as it is, but it's awesome to see it in the observations and in the modeling. And of course, it also just speaks to how much we know and don't know about this process and how much more there might still be to learn. Of course, that's the great thing about meteorology as a whole. It's just such a new science to us, and there's so much out there. But yes, that's one of my favorite things about this paper. But I will switch gears a little bit. I want to continue on to stage 4 here. I know you talked a little bit about the transition from the organizing of the vortex into the tornado. And this includes the bottom up process in it. But can you maybe discuss in the simplest terms as you can? There's a excellent breakdown of this in the paper itself, but could you give a little bit of a brief intro to this process in stage 4, the organization to the tornado?
Yeah, I think I'll give my best to do that. I think this is really one of the more unknown aspects about tornadogenesis, just because a lot of the studies that focus on actual tornado dynamics are really complex and more towards the fluid dynamics side, really relying on equations. There's work by Llewellyn and Fiedler, for example, who did a lot of this in the past. But yeah, what is important here is that once this asymmetric vortex patch organizes to one column or vortex and intensifies, and at that time also the funnel, you might see the first funnel forming because this vortex is intensifying, getting stretched by the low inverse cyclone. And once this happens, we of course get really intensifying winds as well to the ground, close to the ground. And what will develop is what is called the centrifugal force because of this rotation, and the pressure gradient force. And don't worry about these terms. In general, it's only just important that there's a balance between these forces. But close to the ground, this force balance gets disrupted. And that means that the air streams inward close to the ground and then has to, because it converges near the center of the vortex, it has to go somewhere, so it has to erupt upward. And this is what we call a vertical jet, or the corner flow region in tornadoes. Some might have heard of that term. And once this happens, we can basically call the vortex a tornado because it assumes this typical tornado flow features. So this corner flow and the tornado boundary layer. Yeah, maybe just take a look into the paper if you're interested to learn more about these aspects. But yeah, it's really a transition that happens at this time because these flow structures facilitate the tornado to become a steady state vortex, basically. So to last for a long time without being disrupted. And yeah, I think that's all I can say about that without becoming too complicated.
Yeah, that was good. And a lot of it is very heavy in the fluid dynamics side, as you said. So there were certainly a few sentences I had to reread a few times to get the understanding, but it is definitely one of those things where modeling can only do so much. And this is one of the next sections in the paper. And we have to be able to observe it to confirm that it exists. And you talk a lot about observations of tornadogenesis and the mesocyclone genesis and things of that nature. And there's been a lot of campaigns out there, but it just seems to be difficult to be able to see it. And is it just because it is such a small scale process that maybe sometimes we just can't see it, or we're just not in the right position, or what is it that makes it so difficult for us to be able to observe the process happening?
Yeah, at least that's my opinion. It's just these small scales that make it so difficult. And I think there's maybe also one point that is good to make in this paper or by this paper for future research, that we need to become better in our observations, specifically have higher resolution, even higher resolution in the radar observations. I'm really happy that we could include Jenna Hauser and in this paper because they do exactly that, but also other researchers, not just them, working with mobile radars, getting close to tornadoes and trying to get higher and higher resolution data of specifically of the winds around the tornado, but also prior to the tornado, to maybe detect these pre-tornadic vortex patches and vorticity maxima to verify what we see in the simulations. So the paper, one aspect we wanted to include in the paper is that observations are equally important to the simulations, also about tornadogenesis.
Do you have any opinions on what it might take for us to be able to observe these processes? Is it just more intense campaigns? Is it different approaches to observation? Or is it what might it be that helps us to see what's going on?
Yeah, I think we're on a good way. For example, the recent Taurus campaign got some really good data, and maybe or hopefully the analysis of this data will reveal some of these aspects. But I know that Chris Weiss, for example, and others who are really working with high resolution radar observations are now starting to look into these aspects that we see in simulation. So I think we can see a lot of good research coming in the next decade or so, maybe revealing a bit more detail about what's going on. But other than that, I think it's just really hard to, as you can imagine, as a chaser, trying to get to a tornado in time. And even before, for these topics, we need to be there before the tornado forms. So as you can imagine, that's tough on itself. And then doing that with a field campaign, which involves tens of vehicles, a lot of coordination beforehand, a lot of money, that's even more difficult. So I think the research specifically in the US, saying that as a researcher not being in the US, is really good regarding severe storms. And also the forecasting and other things.
Being the Chaser Chat podcast, can't really let the tornado formation talk go without asking, is there something in kind of stages 2 to 3 that might be the precursors to the tornado actually forming that a chaser might be able to see? Let's say we're on the perfect storm and we can see what's going on. Is there something that you think that could be visually spotted for a chaser or storm spotter to be able to see some of this process occurring? Obviously, we know the RFD surge and things like that, but can you visualize to some degree these vortex patches, or can you, to a degree, see the organization of the vorticity or something along those lines?
Great question. I'd never thought about it that way, but I think it's more bad news than good news. I think most of these processes are really invisible. I think the sidebar in the paper also goes into this a little bit. Until there's the funnel forming, which only happens basically once the tornado already is formed, or during the process of forming it, only then you get the first visual cues of what's going on, at least on the scale of the vortex itself. So these stages are not really helpful in seeing or detecting precursors. But I think of a lot of the aspects also that are part of these stages of tornadogenesis, people are already aware of that. For example, the intensity of the low level mesocyclone. I think everyone will know, most people will know to look at the radar, and if you see strong rotation in the low scans, that's one of the best indicators for tornado potential. And then, of course, when you look at the outflow structure, you can also see if it's outflow dominant, for example. That will mean that these patches of vertical vorticity cannot be in the optimal region under the low level mesocyclone because they are offset by the outflow, pushing it away. But these are, I think, all aspects that kind of already known from a different perspective, maybe. But I think that they are also included in this model.
I, of course, appreciate that because everybody's probably waiting. How do I use this? And it is true that these things have all been known. I think what's really important is the organization of the thoughts together to create how abstract or smooth our ability to understand what's actually happening might be. It certainly is a great way to break apart the process into some organized thoughts to see what's happening. And of course, in the future, there's a lot of stuff to look out for, whether it's stuff that's already been observed and then the data is going to be gone through, like you were saying, or new campaigns or whatnot. Or perhaps there's some degree of field observations that spotters can make that might help further this. We know that there's been a lot of things that have been found just by being out in the field and seeing things. And so that's also helpful as well. So I think that begs the question, in the next 10 years, with where we are with setting a new kind of baseline for the process and the data that's been collected in the last several years, where do you think we might be able to go? Do you think that 10 years from now, we might maybe not know the answer, but be a heck of a lot close to being able to say, this is how it works?
Yeah, I think I'm optimistic that at least we'll get improvements. As a researcher, it's always small steps that you get better and better. It's you never have the complete answer. Yeah, I'm optimistic that with the better data we get, more researchers focusing on these aspects, that specifically in these smaller scales, we can really improve some of the understanding in a way that helps us to find better ways to predict tornadogenesis a bit better. Yeah, but I will say also that, like you said a few minutes ago, that this is a conceptual model, and it might be true on average in many cases. But like you say, there's many other instances which things might be completely different. And we also have to learn more about these variations of maybe how differently shaped tornadoes form, how processes might be different in these cases, and not just focus on this one idea, how the average tornado may form.
Certainly, absolutely. And I think that's important to note as well. There really is so much going on. We can't observe it really right now. There are a lot of things that can be happening, and there's a lot of aspects you go in here about negative effects during this process that could disrupt it. There's a whole nother field of things that are involved in this process. So I really recommend this paper, this article in BAMS. This came out, it was just on the 3rd of July or 7th, somewhere in there, I believe, or at least it was made public, but it's just within this month, and it is certainly great for anyone interested in tornadoes, interested in chasing or meteorology as a whole. It certainly is important to the community and for chasers because it is the non-technical review, and it allows us to build a kind of bottom ground and a kind of way to build up from here. And so I appreciate you coming on here. Jen, do you have any last minute thoughts?
Yeah, one thing comes to mind, maybe that I think, like you already said it, but it's always a back and forth between this basic research that we're doing and then what the forecaster perspective, but then also the tracer's perspective or the public's perspective. And nowadays also the social impact perspective, where research is focusing a lot more on. It's always a back and forth between these different fields that is really important to advance also tornadogenesis in the right direction that everyone can benefit.
Absolutely. Okay. I very much thank you for both working with this excellent group of people here to put together this article, to give me something to talk about here for our first episode of Shear Review. And I appreciate you for joining me to chat. I hope that we'll be able to talk more about this and hopefully see some more research that'll be out in the coming months or years to build on this. So I appreciate your time. I thank you for joining. Listeners, I thank you all for tuning in to this first episode of Shear Review. We'll be back here in a little bit with another episode talking about more research in the field of meteorology. So, Jannick, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
All righty. Appreciate it. All right, guys. We'll see you later.
Thanks for listening. If you're not already subscribed, hit that button right now. Then make sure notifications are turned on so you never miss an episode. We need your help keeping Chaser Chat on the air, and there are some awesome ways for you to support the show. The best way is by becoming a subscriber on Patreon. You'll gain access to monthly bonus content like the WX Drama Report, featuring myself and a rotating cast of co-hosts. There's also a 1-hour live expert Q&A with Dr. Cameron Nixon and Trey Greenwood from the Convective Chronicles YouTube channel. There's even a deal where you can bundle all of the bonus content together with a t-shirt or a hoodie, which is pretty fantastic if I do say so myself. If you just want to buy some Chaser Chat swag, check out the merch store for t-shirts, hoodies, hats, coffee mugs, and more. Can't support the show financially? There's still plenty of ways that you can help. Leave a rating and a review on your favorite podcast app, like and comment on YouTube, and share this episode on your favorite social media platform. Links to everything I just mentioned are in the episode description, and your support would mean the world to all of us at Chaser Chat. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you on the next episode.